July 25th, 1944, shortly before 10 in the morning. Nearly 3,000 American aircraft began their assault on the German lines at Normandy, with over 1,500 heavy bombers among them. The sky darkened as wave after wave of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed over the hedgerows, flying so low that soldiers on the ground could see the bomb bay doors opening. On the ground below, Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein looked up at the sky and saw death coming in waves. This was not the first time he had faced enemy attack. He had fought in Poland during the opening campaign of the war in September 1939. He had commanded tanks during the Blitzkrieg through France in 1940. He had served as Chief of Staff to Erwin Rommel in the burning deserts of North Africa, where he learned what it meant to fight against enemies who controlled the air. He had led the 3rd Panzer Division through encirclement at Kirovograd on the Eastern Front, where his men had fought their way out of a Soviet trap through snow and blood. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's highest military decorations, awarded only to those who had demonstrated extraordinary valor in combat. Fritz Bayerlein had survived 3 years of the most brutal warfare in human history against the Soviet Union. He had witnessed the endless retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1941. He had endured the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad from his posting in North Africa, watching reports come in as the 6th Army disappeared into Soviet captivity. He had fought at Kursk, the largest tank battle ever fought, where thousands of armoured vehicles clashed across the steppes in a struggle that broke the offensive power of the Wehrmacht forever. None of it had prepared him for this. The bombs began falling shortly after 9:30. They fell in carpets, wave after wave, turning the Norman countryside into what Bayerlein would later describe as a moonscape. Bomb craters touched rim to rim across miles of hedgerow country. The ancient Norman bocage, with its sunken lanes and earthen walls that had stood for centuries, was obliterated in minutes. Bayerlein's tanks were overturned and buried under tons of earth thrown up by the explosions. His artillery positions were wiped from existence, guns twisted into unrecognizable metal. His infantry positions were flattened as if pressed by the hand of a giant. Foxholes collapsed, bunkers crushed, men buried alive. Every road and track in his sector was destroyed within minutes. Craters 15 feet deep made movement impossible. Trees were splintered into matchwood. Buildings collapsed into rubble. The very landscape was transformed beyond recognition by the sheer weight of explosives falling from the sky. Simultaneously with the storm from the air, innumerable guns of American artillery pounded drumfire into the German positions. The earth shook without ceasing. Men could not hear orders. They could not hear each other. They could hear nothing but the endless thunder of explosions that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Bayerlein watched his men, veterans of the Eastern Front who had survived years of fighting against the Red Army, lose their minds. Several soldiers went mad from the concussion and terror, running in the open until shrapnel cut them down. Others sat motionless in their foxholes, unable to move or respond to orders. Some simply lay on the ground and wept. Hardened soldiers who had faced Soviet tanks without flinching, now reduced to helpless terror by the sheer scale of destruction raining down upon them. The shock effect, as Bayerlein would report to his superiors, was indescribable. Within hours, over 70% of his soldiers were dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armoured formations in the German army, had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. When a messenger arrived from Field Marshal von Kluge demanding that not a single man leave his position, that the line must be held at all costs, Bayerlein erupted with words that would echo through military history. "Out in front, everyone is holding out," he said. "Everyone. My grenadiers and my engineers and my tank crews. They are all holding their ground. Not a single man is leaving his post, not one. They are lying in their foxholes, mute and silent, for they are dead. Dead. You may report to the Field Marshal that the Panzer Lehr Division is annihilated. Only the dead can now hold the line." This was Operation Cobra. This was the moment when one of Nazi Germany's most elite armoured divisions, commanded by one of its most experienced officers, was destroyed in a single afternoon by the application of overwhelming air power. And this was the moment that crystallized what every decorated German soldier who transferred from Russia to Normandy had discovered in the summer of 1944. The Western Front was a different kind of war entirely. It was a war they had not been trained to fight and could not win. To understand what men like Bayerlein experienced when they arrived in France, one must first understand what the Eastern Front had already done to the Wehrmacht by the summer of 1944. The numbers alone stagger the imagination. By June of that year, Germany had suffered approximately 3.3 million casualties on the Eastern Front. This figure included dead, wounded, captured, and missing. Soviet sources would later place total German losses in the East at 6.9 million men across the entire war. The Eastern Front consumed the vast majority of Germany's military casualties, with approximately 80% of all Wehrmacht deaths occurring in the war against the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1944, 3.9 million German troops were deployed against the Soviet Union, compared to roughly 58 divisions in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The war against the Soviet Union was the main event. Everything else was secondary. The conditions these soldiers endured were extreme beyond modern comprehension. When German forces approached Moscow in December of 1941, temperatures plunged to -31 degrees Celsius on December 4th, dropping to -36 degrees the following night. German troops lacked adequate winter clothing, antifreeze for their vehicles, and cold-weather lubricants for their weapons. Headquarters had assumed Moscow would fall before winter arrived. They were wrong. Soldiers froze to death in their foxholes. Frostbite claimed thousands of casualties. Weapons jammed as lubricants turned to gel. Vehicles refused to start. Artillery pieces cracked in the cold. The wounded froze before they could be evacuated. Men burned fuel just to keep from freezing, fuel that was desperately needed for combat operations. The first winter in Russia killed more German soldiers than Soviet bullets. Then came the Rasputitsa. Twice, each year, in spring and autumn, the Russian mud season transformed unpaved roads into bottomless swamps. Supply deliveries dropped to roughly 1/3 of requirements. A German general recalled that the reality far exceeded their worst expectations. All-wheeled vehicles sank up to their axles in the slime. Horses drowned in mud. Soldiers carried supplies on their backs because no vehicle could move. The front stagnated while armies waited for the ground to freeze or dry. By 1943 and 44, the war in the East had become a grinding retreat. After the catastrophic defeat at Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, the Red Army permanently seized the strategic initiative. The Wehrmacht lost the Dnieper line, the last major natural defensive barrier before Poland. German forces survived encirclement at the Korsun pocket only with horrific casualties, abandoning their wounded and heavy equipment to escape Soviet pincers. In June 1944, precisely as the Allies landed in Normandy, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration against Army Group Center. This offensive destroyed 28 of 34 German divisions in the sector within 8 weeks. Germany suffered 400,000 to 450,000 casualties. General Heinz Guderian, one of the fathers of armored warfare, admitted simply that Army Group Center had ceased to exist. This was also a war of annihilation, a Vernichtungskrieg, driven by ideology. Combat was close quarters. Partisan warfare was endemic behind German lines. The concept of quarter was largely absent on both sides. Prisoners were frequently shot. Villages were burned. Civilians were murdered. The Eastern Front was not simply a military campaign. It was a race war of extermination, in which surrender often meant death, and no mercy was expected or given. The psychological toll on German soldiers was immense. Men who survived years of this fighting developed a hardness that civilians could not comprehend. They had watched friends die beside them in frozen trenches. They had bayoneted enemies in hand-to-hand combat. They had marched past the bodies of executed prisoners and the smoking ruins of destroyed villages. They had become accustomed to death on a scale that the Western Allies could barely imagine. These were the men who were sent to France. Battle-hardened veterans who had survived everything the Soviet Union could throw at them. They wore their decorations with the quiet confidence of men who knew they had faced the worst and prevailed. The Iron Cross Second Class was common among them. Many wore the Iron Cross First Class. Some displayed the coveted wound badges that marked them as men who had bled for their country and returned to fight again. A few wore the Knight's Cross at their throats, marking them as heroes of the Reich. France, by contrast, had long been the Wehrmacht's rest and recuperation zone. Divisions shattered on the Eastern Front were sent west to absorb new equipment and fresh replacements, to train new soldiers and rebuild their strength before returning to the main war. A few weeks in France to forget the war as far as possible was a dream that ran close behind a long furlough in the minds of Eastern Front veterans. The coastal defense divisions in France were commonly regarded as little more than clerks in uniform by the real soldiers from the real war. That perception would prove catastrophically wrong. The Panzer Lehr Division was special among the formations sent to France. Unlike most German divisions, it had been built from instructors at the armoured warfare training schools, men who taught tank tactics and combined arms operations to new recruits. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the teachers who trained others to fight. Roughly 60% of its personnel were veterans of the Eastern Front or North Africa. Every one of its Panzer Grenadier battalions was mounted in armoured half-tracks rather than trucks, making it the only fully mechanized division in the entire German army. The division fielded over 200 tanks, including 86 Panthers. The Panther was the best medium tank Germany produced, superior to the American Sherman in armor and firepower. Panzer Lehr also had 97 Mark, 4 tanks, and 31 Jagdpanzer, 4 tank destroyers. Its commander, Fritz Bayerlein, had personally fought in Poland, France, Russia, and North Africa. He was one of the most experienced armoured warfare officers alive. When the division was ordered to France in the spring of 1944, many of its soldiers saw the transfer as a blessing. They would have time to train, to rest, to prepare for whatever came next. The war in the East would continue without them, at least for a while. They had survived. They had earned a respite. The Allied invasion of Normandy began on June 6, 1944. Panzer Lehr was stationed near Chartres, roughly 200 kilometers from the beaches. When the order came to move to the front, Bayerlein expected a routine road march of the kind his division had performed dozens of times in Russia. In the east, German armoured formations regularly moved by daylight without serious interference from Soviet aircraft. The Luftwaffe, while weakening, could still provide localized air superiority over major operations. Soviet tactical aviation, while growing stronger, operated primarily close to the front line. What happened instead was slaughter. The march to Normandy took place on June 7th. From the moment Panzer Lehr's vehicles reached the main roads, American and British fighter bombers descended on them. P-47. Thunderbolts with their 8 50-caliber machine guns and bomb loads attacked in waves. Hawker Typhoons with their 4 20mm cannon and rocket projectiles strafed columns with deadly accuracy. The aircraft dove on German vehicles, fired their weapons, climbed away, and returned for another pass. There was no respite. There was no defense. There was only death from above. The division's soldiers coined a name for the route. They called it the Jabo-Rennstrecke, the fighter bomber racecourse. The term captured the endless circling of Allied aircraft hunting for targets, swooping down like predators on any vehicle that dared to move. In a single day of movement, Panzer Lehr lost 84 half-tracks and self-propelled guns, 5 tanks, and 130 trucks. These were not combat losses inflicted by enemy ground forces. These were vehicles destroyed on the open road by aircraft against which the division had virtually no defense. The few anti-aircraft guns the division possessed could not protect a column spread across miles of road. And even when they shot down an aircraft, there were always more. On the Eastern Front, such a road march would have been routine. German divisions moved by road constantly, repositioning to meet Soviet thrusts, concentrating for counterattacks, withdrawing to new defensive lines. Air attack was a nuisance, not a catastrophe. Soviet aircraft might strafe a column and destroy a few vehicles, but they lacked the numbers, the training, and the coordination to prevent German movement altogether. In Normandy, daylight movement was suicide. The experience transformed how German soldiers thought about warfare. On the Eastern Front, they had learned to fear the Soviet soldier, the partisans lurking in the forests, the endless cold, the mud that swallowed vehicles whole. In Normandy, they learned to fear the sky itself. They became creatures of the night, moving only after darkness fell, hiding in barns and hedgerows during daylight hours, praying that the clouds would come and ground the aircraft that hunted them without mercy. Officers who had commanded battalions and regiments through years of Eastern Front combat found themselves helpless against an enemy they could not engage. Their training emphasized fire and movement, concentration of force, exploitation of success. All of this was impossible when movement itself meant death. The tactical excellence that had made the Wehrmacht the most formidable ground force in the world meant nothing when the enemy controlled everything above the treetops. Bayerlein would later tell interrogators that his division would be more effective in Russia than Normandy. The bocage terrain, with its ancient hedgerows and sunken lanes, negated the advantages of his long-barreled Panther tanks. The Panthers could not see far enough to use their superior range. They could not maneuver in the narrow lanes. But the air situation was the decisive factor. Every movement invited destruction from above. Every concentration of vehicles attracted swarms of fighter bombers. Every supply column had to move by night, delaying operations and exhausting men who had to fight during the day. The contrast with the Eastern Front could not have been starker. On June 6th, the Allies deployed nearly 12,000 aircraft against 815 Luftwaffe planes. The ratio exceeded 15-1. The Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties on D-Day, while Allied forces flew over 14,000 missions. Daily Allied air sorties averaged 6,000 throughout the campaign. German soldiers could not move, could not concentrate, and could not counterattack without facing immediate annihilation from the sky. The naval dimension was entirely without precedent in the experience of any German soldier who had fought exclusively on the Eastern Front. Nearly 7,000 ships, boats, and amphibious craft participated in Operation Neptune. This armada included 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and more than 100 destroyers and escort vessels. These ships carried guns that dwarfed anything in the German arsenal. A 14-inch naval gun could fire a shell weighing over 1,000 pounds more than 20 miles. Naval vessels unleashed devastating bombardments during the pre-landing assault. Battleships, employing 14-inch and 16-inch guns, reduced concrete fortifications to rubble. Naval gunfire support continued for weeks until the front moved beyond range. A single battleship could deliver as much firepower as a full artillery regiment in a matter of minutes. The shells came from over the horizon, from ships the German soldiers could not even see, let alone engage. Nothing remotely comparable existed on the Eastern Front, where naval power was largely irrelevant to the ground war. The Baltic and Black Seas were contested waters where neither side achieved decisive superiority. No Soviet battleship ever bombarded German ground forces with 16-inch shells. No flotilla of cruisers ever provided fire support for Red Army infantry. The experience of being under naval bombardment was unique to soldiers who fought in the West. The shells came without warning. A soldier on the Eastern Front could usually hear the artillery that was about to kill him. The distinctive crack of Soviet guns, the whistle of incoming rounds, gave men at least a moment to seek cover. Naval shells travelled faster than sound. The first indication of a naval bombardment was often the explosion itself, the ground erupting in a volcano of earth and steel and fire. Men learned to fear the distant grey shapes on the horizon, ships that seemed impossibly far away but could reach out and destroy anything within 20 miles of the coast. The effect on morale was devastating. These were soldiers who had faced Soviet tank attacks without flinching, who had held their positions under bombardments that lasted for hours, who had survived encirclements that killed half their comrades. They had never experienced anything like this. The combination of air attack from above and naval bombardment from the sea created a killing zone from which there was no escape. Every direction offered death. Fritz Witt, the first commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, discovered this brutal reality on June 14, 8 days after D-Day. His command post was located several miles behind the front line, a distance that would have provided complete safety from Soviet ground forces. A divisional headquarters in the east could operate with relative security as long as it remained behind the front, protected by the units in the line. But Witt's headquarters was not safe from naval guns. A 15-inch shell from a Royal Navy battleship struck the building directly. The shell weighed nearly a ton and was fired from a ship more than 15 miles offshore. Witt and his staff were killed instantly. In Russia, a division commander could operate from a headquarters without fear of naval gunfire. In Normandy, no place was safe. The decorated tank ace, Michael Wittmann, learned these lessons in his final weeks of life. Wittmann was a legend of the Eastern Front. He had joined the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler before the war and fought through every major campaign. As commander of a Tiger tank company, he had destroyed over 120 enemy vehicles during operations at Kharkov, Kursk, and the Zhytomyr counterattacks. During the Battle of Kursk, he was credited with destroying 30 Red Army tanks and 28 guns across the fighting. His Tiger, with its 88mm gun and thick frontal armor, had been nearly invulnerable in frontal engagements against Soviet armor. The standard Soviet T-34 could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at any combat range. The Tiger could destroy a T-34 at ranges exceeding a mile. Wittmann had used this advantage to devastating effect, racking up a kill count that made him one of the most famous tank aces of the war. Wittmann transferred to Normandy with the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion in early June 1944. On June 13th, he achieved his most famous victory at Villers-Bocage. A British armoured column from the 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, was advancing into a gap in the German lines. Wittmann spotted the column from a concealed position and attacked alone. In approximately 15 minutes, he destroyed up to 14 British tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and 2 anti-tank guns. His single Tiger halted a British advance and earned him promotion and the highest decorations the Third Reich could bestow. It was the kind of victory he had achieved many times in Russia, a single tank commander using superior tactics and firepower to devastate an enemy formation. But Normandy was fundamentally different from the Eastern Front. During the march to the front, his company was reduced from full strength to only 6 operational Tigers. This was not the result of combat with enemy ground forces. It was the result of Allied fighter-bomber attacks. Aircraft that Wittmann had rarely worried about in Russia destroyed his tanks before they ever reached the battlefield. As Wittmann himself noted after Villers-Bocage, he had to act quickly because he had to assume the enemy had already spotted him and would destroy him where he stood. This urgency reflected total Allied air supremacy. In Russia, a Tiger commander had far more freedom to maneuver, to choose his moment of attack, to withdraw and reposition. In Normandy, every minute exposed was a minute when aircraft might spot you and call in an airstrike. German tactical documents from 1944 acknowledged the shift. The Tiger, they noted, could no longer prance around oblivious to the laws of tank tactics. The invincibility that Wittmann had enjoyed in Russia simply did not exist in France. The Tiger remained a devastating weapon in direct combat, but it could be destroyed by aircraft, by naval gunfire, by artillery concentrations of a density the Eastern Front had never seen. Wittmann lasted exactly 2 months in Normandy. On August 8, 1944, during Operation Totalize near Sintho, his Tiger was destroyed. The exact circumstances remain debated. Some historians credit a Sherman Firefly with its 17-pounder gun. Others suggest multiple Shermans firing together. What is certain is that Michael Wittmann, who had destroyed over 130 enemy vehicles across years of combat on the Eastern Front, was killed in his first real campaign in the West. He was 30 years old. His remains were not identified and recovered until 1983. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, comprising the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, represented the most dramatic direct transfer from east to west. Both divisions had been sent from France to the Eastern Front in March 1944 to rescue the encircled 1st Panzer Army at the Kamenets-Podolsky Pocket in Ukraine. The Hohenstaufen saw its first combat in early April 1944 during the relief operation. The division fought Soviet forces attempting to annihilate the trapped German formation, conducting attacks and counterattacks across the muddy spring landscape of western Ukraine. It was brutal fighting against a determined enemy, exactly the kind of combat that Eastern Front veterans understood and had learned to survive. Just 2 months later, on June 12, both divisions were loaded onto trains in Poland for the return journey west. They had been fighting the Red Army in April. By late June, they were in combat against the British at Hill 112 in Normandy. The transition was jarring. Everything they knew about warfare had to be relearned. Their reaction was documented by historians. In J.J. Howe's book on Hill 112, an Eastern Front veteran from these divisions stated that British artillery was far worse than anything they had experienced on the Eastern Front. This assessment came from soldiers who had faced Soviet forces in direct combat only weeks earlier. They had survived the Eastern Front. They found Normandy worse. The explanation was mathematical. In Russia, roughly 10 German divisions might be spread across a 600-mile front. Each division defended a sector of 60 miles or more. In Normandy, the same number of divisions was compressed into a 60-mile sector. The intensity of combat per unit of frontage was therefore 10 times greater. Every shell, every bullet, every bomb was concentrated into a space where nothing could survive for long. Add to this the overwhelming Allied superiority in artillery ammunition. German guns could fire only about 10% of what British guns fired. Allied logistics brought ammunition across the beaches and through the artificial Mulberry harbours in quantities the German supply system could not match. A German battery might have enough shells for a few hours of sustained fire. Allied batteries could fire for days without pausing. And add to this the air supremacy that prevented German reinforcement and resupply. Trains were bombed before they reached the front. Trucks were strafed on the roads. Even horse-drawn wagons were attacked by roving fighter bombers. The German army in Normandy was being strangled, cut off from the resources it needed to fight, while the Allies poured men and material across the beaches. Kurt Meyer, who commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend after Witt's death, had fought through the entire Eastern Front campaign. He participated in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He fought along the Dnieper River as the Wehrmacht retreated from its high water mark. He was at Kharkov and Kursk with the Leibstandarte. He was one of the most decorated SS officers in the Wehrmacht, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. His memoir, Grenadiers, provides vivid comparisons between the fronts. On the Falaise pocket in August 1944, with his division compressed into a killing zone as the Allies closed a trap around the German armies in Normandy, Meyer wrote that concentrated in such a confined space, they offered unique targets for enemy air power. Death shadowed them at every step. The 12th SS entered Normandy with 20,540 men. By the time the survivors escaped the Falaise pocket, the division had suffered over 8,000 casualties. 94% of its armour was destroyed. Only a few hundred men remained capable of combat, with the rest being wounded, rear echelon personnel, or too exhausted to fight. In less than 3 months, a division built with Hitler Youth volunteers and commanded by Eastern Front veterans had been shattered. The survivors who escaped the pocket had lost almost everything: their tanks, their vehicles, their heavy weapons, their comrades. The German soldiers' dark humour captured the absurdity of the air situation better than any official report. A joke circulated throughout the German forces in Normandy. If British planes appear, we duck. If American planes come over, everyone ducks. And if the Luftwaffe appears, nobody ducks, because there was nothing to duck from. The Luftwaffe simply did not appear over Normandy in any meaningful numbers. A companion joke about aircraft identification became equally famous among German soldiers. If it is silver, it is American. If it is camouflaged, it is British. If you cannot see it at all, that is the Luftwaffe. The bitterness behind the humour was unmistakable. These men had fought for years believing in German military superiority. In Normandy, they discovered that superiority meant nothing against enemies who controlled the sky. The Germans coined specific terminology for this new phenomenon. They spoke of Jabo Tod, death by fighter bomber. They spoke of Jabo jitters for the psychological anxiety of constant air attack. Every soldier in Normandy learned to scan the sky constantly, to listen for the sound of aircraft engines, to dive for cover at the first sign of approaching planes. The stress was relentless. Even at night, even in the rear areas, the threat never entirely disappeared. So devastating was the effect of Allied air power that General Major Botho Elster eventually surrendered his entire command of nearly 20,000 troops to the Americans. The aircraft had beaten him before his men ever engaged American infantry in force. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had commanded German forces in North Africa and understood Allied air power from bitter experience, produced the war's most devastating assessment of its impact. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. In a letter to his wife, on June 10, 4 days after D-Day, Rommel wrote simply that the enemy's air superiority had a very grave effect on German movements. There was simply no answer to it. Rommel knew. He had faced British and American air power in Tunisia. He had watched his supply lines destroyed from the air, his convoys sunk, His troops strafed and bombed whenever they moved. Normandy was Tunisia, multiplied by 10. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had commanded Army Group Center on the Eastern Front for 2 years, arrived in France to replace von Rundstedt as commander of all German forces in the West. Von Kluge was a leathery Prussian veteran who had witnessed the worst the Red Army could deliver. He had commanded the defense against Soviet winter offensives. He had overseen the brutal fighting at Rougev. He understood the Eastern Front as well as any German general. After touring the Normandy front, he telephoned Berlin on July 12 with a message that defined the catastrophe. "I want to stress once again that I am no pessimist," he said. "But in my view, the situation could not be grimmer." Days later, von Kluge wrote directly to Hitler in terms that captured the fundamental difference between the fronts. "In the face of total enemy air superiority," he wrote, "we can adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air, except to retire from the battlefield." In Russia, the Wehrmacht had developed flexible defensive tactics that traded space for time and used mobile reserves to seal breakthroughs. In Normandy, those tactics were impossible. The reserves could not move. Any concentration of forces was spotted from the air and destroyed. Untersturmführer Helmut Gunther, of the 17th SS Panzer Division, had witnessed the first retreat from Moscow in December 1941. He knew what defeat looked like on the Eastern Front. He had experienced the chaos and horror of that first winter, when German forces fell back from the gates of the Soviet capital in bitter cold and confusion. "I had seen the first retreat from Moscow, which was terrible enough," he recalled, "but at least units were still intact. Here, we had become a cluster of individuals. We were not a battle-worthy company any longer. All that we had going for us was that we knew each other very well. The Eastern Front destroyed armies over years. Normandy shattered units in days. By the end of June, less than a month after D-Day, the Allies had landed over 850,000 troops, 570,000 tons of supplies, and 150,000 vehicles across the Normandy beaches. The logistical capacity of the Western Allies, supported by industrial production on a scale Germany could not match, meant that every German defensive success was temporary. The Allies could replace their losses overnight. The Germans could not replace theirs at all. The contrast in industrial capacity was staggering. The United States alone produced more aircraft in 1944 than Germany had produced in the entire war up to that point. American factories churned out Sherman tanks at a rate of over 1,000 per month. British and Canadian production added to this flood of material. German factories, bombed constantly by Allied strategic air power, struggled to maintain production of far smaller numbers of technically superior but mechanically unreliable vehicles. Every German officer understood what these numbers meant. They could win every tactical engagement and still lose the war. They could destroy 2 Allied tanks for every one they lost and still be ground down to nothing. The mathematics of industrial warfare favored the side that could produce the most, not the side that fought the best. Germany was fighting the war it had trained for. The Allies were fighting the war they could win. In the 3 months of the Normandy campaign, the Wehrmacht suffered approximately 200,000 casualties and lost another 200,000 men to Allied captivity. The rate of attrition exceeded even the Eastern Front in its intensity, compressed as it was into a tiny geographic area under constant air attack. Historian Anthony Beevor wrote that the ferocity of the fighting in Normandy can never be in doubt. And despite the sneers of Soviet propagandists, the battle for Normandy was certainly comparable to that of the Eastern Front in its demands upon the soldiers who fought there. Max Hastings, in his definitive history Overlord, reached a similar conclusion. In the demands they made upon the foot soldier, he wrote, "The battles in Normandy came closer than any other in the West in the Second World War to matching the horror of the Eastern Front or of Flanders 30 years earlier." Bayerlein, reflecting on his experiences after the war, offered a strategic judgment that captured the transformation in warfare he had witnessed. Not even the battles of annihilation of the 1940 Blitzkrieg in France, or in 1941 in Russia, he concluded, could approach the Battle of Annihilation in France in 1944 in the magnitude of their planning, the logic of their execution, the collaboration of sea, air, and ground forces. This was the key insight. On the Eastern Front, Germany had fought a war of soldiers against soldiers, armies against armies, and tactics against tactics. The Wehrmacht had been the superior tactical force for most of that war, inflicting casualties at a higher rate than it received, winning battles even as it lost the war. German training was better. German officers were more flexible. German soldiers showed more initiative. These advantages mattered in Russia. In Normandy, Germany fought a war of soldiers against an industrial system. Individual courage meant nothing against carpet bombing. Tactical excellence meant nothing against naval gunfire. Initiative meant nothing when the enemy could see everything from the sky, could destroy anything that moved, could land more reinforcements and supplies in a single week than Germany could produce in a month. And the industrial system won. The decorated men who made this journey from east to west, from Russia to Normandy, from one kind of war to another, left behind a unique historical record. Their testimonies were preserved in memoirs written years later, in interrogation transcripts compiled by Allied intelligence officers, in letters home that survived the war, and in the careful work of historians who gathered oral histories before the last veterans died. Fritz Bayerlein survived the destruction of the Panzer Lehr Division. He was captured by American forces in April 1945 and spent years as a prisoner of war, during which he wrote over 20 manuscripts for the United States Army Historical Division documenting German operations. He died in 1970 in Würzburg, the city of his birth. His account of Operation Cobra remains one of the most vivid descriptions of aerial bombardment ever recorded. Kurt Meyer was captured by Belgian police in September 1944. He was tried for war crimes related to the murder of Canadian prisoners by troops under his command and sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in 1954 and died in 1961 at the age of 51. His memoir remains a primary source for understanding the German experience in Normandy. Hans von Luck, who commanded a Panzer Grenadier Regiment in the 21st Panzer Division, survived the war and spent 5 years in Soviet captivity. His memoir, Panzer Commander, was praised by military historians as having no match for sheer breadth of recorded experience. He had fought in Poland, France, Russia, North Africa, and Normandy. He died in 1997. The war cemeteries of Normandy contain the graves of tens of thousands of German soldiers, many of them Eastern Front veterans, who found death not in the frozen steppes of Russia, but in the hedgerows of France. Their headstones bear witness to the concentration of violence that characterized the campaign, so many graves in so small an area from so short a time. At La Cambe German War Cemetery, more than 21,000 German soldiers are buried. Many of the graves are marked simply with names and dates, nothing more. Others bear the notation of units that had served across Europe, from the steppes of Russia to the beaches of France. Some stones mark the resting places of men who wore the Knight's Cross, tank aces and infantry leaders who had survived years of combat only to die in the fields of Normandy. The French landscape itself bears the scars of the fighting. Craters from naval shells and aerial bombs can still be traced in the terrain. The remains of bunkers and fortifications dot the coastline. Museums preserve the equipment and documents of both sides, telling the story of men who fought and died in a struggle that shaped the modern world. The paradox, at the heart of the German experience in Normandy, remains striking 8 decades later. The Eastern Front was unquestionably the larger conflict, the longer war, the more brutal theatre of operations. It stretched across a continent for nearly 4 years. It killed millions on both sides. It featured atrocities and mass murder on a scale that makes it one of history's greatest catastrophes. Yet many veterans who survived years of fighting in Russia found Normandy more immediately terrifying. The explanation lies not in the scale of the suffering, but in its character. On the Eastern Front, a German division could still move by day without certain destruction. It could still expect some Luftwaffe support over critical operations. It could still maneuver in the open when necessary. The horror was cumulative, building over months and years of endless winters, endless retreats, and endless casualties ground down by a war that seemed to have no end. In Normandy, the horror was instantaneous and total. A division could be annihilated in a single afternoon of carpet bombing. A tank ace with 120 kills could be destroyed in 8 weeks. A command post miles behind the front could be hit by a naval shell fired from over the horizon. Every road, every intersection, every bridge was under constant surveillance from aircraft against which German defences were largely ineffective. The men who experienced both understood the difference in ways that historians can only approximate. They had survived the savage Eastern Front, where the enemy was ruthless but the battlefield still allowed for maneuver, for initiative, for the small victories that kept soldiers fighting even in defeat. They arrived in Normandy, expecting a secondary theatre, a rest cure, a posting that would give them time to recover. Instead, they encountered a new form of warfare, one defined not by the courage or skill of individual soldiers, but by the overwhelming application of industrial firepower from sea, air, and land simultaneously. They discovered that tactical excellence meant nothing when the enemy could see everything from the sky, when artillery could fire without limit, when battleships could devastate targets from miles away. Bayerlein used the word Materialschlacht, battle of materials, to describe what he experienced. It was not merely a descriptive term. It was a diagnosis of why Germany was losing. The Wehrmacht had built an army of highly trained professional soldiers led by experienced officers using sophisticated tactical doctrine refined over years of combat. That army was being destroyed not by a superior enemy army, but by superior enemy production. The testimonies of these decorated German soldiers stand as a record of what happens when veteran forces, among the most experienced in history, encounter a fundamentally different kind of war. They had fought the savage, endless war in Russia, where survival depended on skill and courage and luck. They died in the industrial killing fields of France, where skill and courage counted for little against the weight of material that fell upon them. Their words remain preserved in the historical record. Bayerlein reporting that only the dead could hold the line. Wittmann forced to attack immediately because he knew the enemy could see him. Meyer watching his division lose most of its combat strength in 3 months. The veteran of the Hohenstaufen declaring that British artillery was worse than anything he had experienced fighting the Soviets. These statements constitute one of the most striking contrasts in the history of modern warfare. They tell us something essential about the nature of industrialized conflict, about the limits of courage and skill when facing overwhelming material superiority, and about the experience of men caught between two very different kinds of war. The soldiers who fought on both fronts understood something that strategic planners and historians have sometimes struggled to articulate. The Eastern Front and the Western Front were not simply two theatres of the same war. They were two different wars fought simultaneously by the same nation. One was a continental struggle of armies against armies stretching across thousands of miles. The other was a concentrated killing zone where industrial firepower was compressed into a space where nothing could survive for long. The decorated German veterans who made that journey, from the endless horizons of Russia to the hedgerows of Normandy, from one kind of death to another, left behind a record of what they saw and what they endured. Their testimony honors no nation and glorifies no cause. It simply bears witness to what war was like for men who experienced its worst forms on both sides of Europe in the final year of the greatest conflict in human history. They fought on the Eastern Front and survived. They transferred to Normandy and discovered that survival itself had become impossible against the combined power of industrial nations determined to destroy them. That discovery, recorded in their own words, preserved in the archives of the nations that defeated them, remains one of the most important documents of the Second World War.